Caleb Turner lived far from town, on a quiet piece of land that stretched wider than the eye could see. Days on his small ranch looked the same, peaceful and silent. He woke before sunrise, fed his horses, checked the fences, and tended to the fields. He did not talk much, and he did not visit town unless he needed supplies. People who knew him said he was a good man but kept to himself. Caleb did not mind. The land gave him enough company, and the calm around him was something he had grown to appreciate. There was no noise, no trouble, and no one to depend on him. It was a simple life, and that was enough for him. Or at least, he believed so. One cold evening, the wind blew harder than usual. Clouds covered the moon, and the sky grew dark earlier. Caleb had finished locking the barn and walked inside the cabin, expecting a quiet night. He made a small fire, warmed a pot of coffee, and sat at the wooden table with an old book he had read many times. The only sound was the wind pushing against the windows. He planned to sleep early, because mornings on the ranch always came fast. But just as he stood up to put out the candle, he heard something, a soft, unsure knock at his door. It was so faint, he almost ignored it, thinking it might be the wind hitting the wood. But then it came again, only slightly louder. Caleb froze for a moment. Nobody knocked on his door at this hour. Very few people ever came at all, and when they did, they came during the day. With slow steps, he reached the door, hand ready on the latch. He opened it a few inches, then wider, and the sight in front of him made him forget the cold rushing through the opening. A young Apache woman stood there, exhausted, shaking, her clothes soaked from the wind and dust. She held a small baby wrapped in a thin cloth, pressing the child close to her chest, as if trying to keep him warm with the last bit of strength she had left. Her hair was loose and tangled, her face pale, her breathing heavy. She looked like she had walked miles without rest. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. She managed to raise her hands slightly, as if offering the baby to him. Then her knees weakened. Before she could fall onto the icy ground, Caleb moved quickly and caught her by the shoulders. The baby let out a small cry, thin and tired, like he, too, had no energy left. Caleb did not ask questions. He opened the door wider and gently carried both mother and child inside his cabin. He placed the woman on the small bed near the fire and then checked the baby, who was cold but breathing steadily. The woman's eyelids fluttered, struggling to stay open, and she whispered something he could not catch. She looked scared, as if even in his cabin she expected danger to follow her. Caleb spoke softly, telling her she was safe and that he would help. His voice was calm, the same voice he used to soothe frightened horses. He offered her a cup of warm water, supporting her back as she tried to drink. Her hands were trembling so badly, he had to hold the cup for her. She took a few small sips before her strength faded again. He placed more logs into the fire to warm the room. The baby was crying softly now, not out of shock, but hunger and cold. Caleb found a small pot, warmed some milk, and fed the child little by little. He had no experience with babies, only horses, cattle, and stray dogs, but he understood care. He understood the look of someone who needed help. When the baby finally slept, Caleb wrapped him in a thicker blanket. The woman watched everything with grateful yet frightened eyes, blinking slowly, fighting sleep but unable to stay awake. Caleb gave her more water and a bit of soft bread to help her regain strength. She ate only a little before her eyes closed fully. Her breathing steadied but remained weak, like someone who had been walking for hours without food or rest. Caleb sat on a chair near the fire and watched them both, trying to understand what had driven them to his door on such a night. He saw bruises on her arms, not from harm, but from travel and hardship. Her shoes were thin and worn down, the kind that offered no protection during long journeys. Her blanket was torn at the corners, barely enough to keep a baby warm. He thought of writing for help, but the storm outside was growing worse. Strong winds made the cabin shake slightly. Even if he had gone, there was no guarantee he would find anyone awake at this hour. So he stayed. He checked the baby's breathing again, then looked at the mother's face, peaceful now but still marked by worry. As he sat there, he tried to imagine what had happened. Women with babies did not travel alone in the dark. Something had pushed her into danger. Something serious enough to make her knock on a stranger's door. He wondered if someone was searching for her, or if she had escaped trouble that might come looking. But he pushed the thought aside. Right now, all that mattered was that she and her baby were safe under his roof. Hours passed. Caleb did not sleep. Every time the wind rattled the window, he looked at the door, half expecting another knock. Not from fear, but from a feeling he had not felt in years, a sense of responsibility. He could not explain it. But seeing the mother and child in his bed awakened something inside him, something warm and protective. He had lived alone for a long time, and now 2 lives depended on him, at least for the moment. When the storm finally slowed, and dawn touched the horizon with a pale light, Caleb leaned forward in his chair, tired but alert. He walked to the window. The land looked peaceful again, almost pretending nothing happened the night before. But everything had changed inside the cabin. He turned back to look at the mother and child, still sleeping softly under the blankets. He moved quietly around the room, preparing a small breakfast. He checked his horses in the early light, making sure no tracks or strangers had passed during the night. Nothing. Only the wind had touched the ground. When he returned inside, the woman was awake, looking around with uncertainty. Her eyes landed on her child first, then the walls, then him. She sat up slowly, as if expecting to be thrown out or questioned. Caleb reassured her with a small nod, telling her she was safe. He spoke gently, offering her warm food and water. She thanked him with a soft whisper, still unsure of how much she could trust him. She tried to stand but felt dizzy. Caleb steadied her carefully, guiding her back to the bed. She held her baby close, with her shaking hands. She seemed ready to protect the child even if she had nothing left to give. He told her she could rest as long as she needed. The land around them was quiet, and no one would disturb them. Slowly, she relaxed, though her eyes still held a trace of fear, like someone who had lived too long in danger. Caleb did not push her to speak. He understood that some stories take time to come out. For now, she needed safety more than anything. He cleaned the cabin, fixed more blankets, and prepared to care for them until she was strong enough to talk. That morning, with sunlight touching the wooden floor and the fire still warm, Caleb realized something unexpected. He did not know the woman's name or the baby's. He did not know her story, and he had no idea what trouble might be following her. But he knew one thing. With complete clarity, sending them away was not an option. The moment he opened his door last night, their lives became tied to his, even if only for a short time. And as he watched the young mother gently cradle her sleeping baby, he understood something else. His quiet, solitary life had changed forever. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt like a place where someone needed him, and he found that he did not mind at all. In fact, a part of him welcomed the change, though he did not admit it out loud. He stood near the doorway, looking at the land outside, and then back at the small family resting inside his home. Whatever story she carried, whatever danger she had escaped, he knew he would face it. He was not a man who turned away from people in need. And now, 2 people, a mother and her tiny child, were depending on him, even if they didn't know it yet. The sun rose a little higher, warming the room. A new day began, and with it, a new purpose entered Caleb's life, quietly but powerfully. He had no idea that the simple act of opening his door would lead to a journey he never planned, with people he never expected. But he did know this. He would not let anything happen to them. Not now. Not ever. The morning light made the small cabin feel warmer. But Nayeli still sat with her child held tightly against her chest, as if she feared someone would burst through the door at any moment. Her eyes followed every movement Caleb made. Not out of distrust anymore, but out of confusion and uncertainty. She had expected danger that night, not kindness. She had expected rejection, not shelter. So now she watched him closely, trying to understand who this quiet cowboy was and why he had cared enough to open his door to a stranger. Caleb prepared simple food, bread, warm milk, and a small bowl of stew from the pot he kept ready during cold nights. He placed it near her gently, not wanting to startle her, and stepped back to give her space. Nayeli hesitated at first, but the hunger in her stomach and the soft cry of her baby pushed her to accept the kindness. She ate slowly, saving some of the soft bread for her baby, dipping it lightly in the warm milk so the child could swallow it easily. Caleb watched from across the room, impressed by her quiet strength. Even in her exhausted state, even with fear still clinging to her, she thought of her baby first. After a while, Caleb spoke softly. He introduced himself, telling her his name and that he lived alone on this ranch. He told her she didn't need to worry about anything for now, that she and her child could rest safely under his roof. She listened closely, her eyes showing both relief and disbelief. She had run so far, expecting danger behind every step, and here she was being told she could rest. She did not fully know how to accept that yet. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost trembling. She introduced herself as Nayeli and said her baby's name was Atsadi. Caleb repeated their names aloud, so she would know he took them seriously. She nodded slowly, holding her child a little closer. For a long time, neither of them said anything else. Caleb waited patiently. He could see she had a story she needed to share, but he did not pressure her. He cleaned the table, fed the horses, and checked the saddle straps on his best mare. When he returned, Nayeli looked as if she had gathered her courage. She began in simple words, her eyes looking at the floor rather than at him. She explained that her husband had passed away months ago, leaving her and her baby without protection in the camp. She had no family left, and without a husband, her position was weak. Some men in her camp believed she could not raise a child alone. A few of them wanted to take the child away, saying a woman alone would fail to give the baby a proper life. But Nayeli knew the real reason they wanted revenge on her husband's name, and the baby symbolized something they hated. Nayeli had refused to give her child up. She protected Atsadi with everything she had, even when they warned her she would regret it. 2 nights before she arrived at Caleb's ranch, the threats grew stronger. She learned the men had planned to take her baby while she slept. She overheard them whispering outside her lodge. She knew she had no time to defend herself or argue, so she ran quietly, without packing anything more than a thin blanket and a small flask of water. She carried Atsadi in her arms and walked the long dirt paths in the dark, avoiding towns and camps, hoping no one would follow her. As she told her story, tears gathered in her eyes but did not fall. She was too tired for crying. Caleb listened without interrupting. Every word she spoke made her shoulders shake slightly, not from cold, but from the memory of fear. When she finished, she looked at Caleb with eyes full of apology. She felt guilty for bringing her danger to someone else's door. Caleb walked to the fire and added more wood. He let her story settle in his mind. He felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, but a deep sense of responsibility. He turned to her and spoke gently, telling her she had made the right choice to leave, that she had done the bravest thing a mother could do. He told her no one was going to take her child while she was here, and no one would harm them as long as they stayed on his land. Nayeli looked down, surprised by the kindness in his voice. No one had spoken to her with such understanding for a long time. She had expected him to ask her to leave, or fear her problems. Instead, he offered safety without hesitation. The rest of the day passed quietly, with soft moments that slowly built trust between them. Nayeli helped clean the small cabin, though Caleb told her she didn't need to. She insisted, wanting to feel useful rather than helpless. She washed dishes, swept the floor, and even helped mend a tear in Caleb's old blanket. She moved carefully, still weak from her long journey, but determined to show respect and gratitude. Caleb worked outside, repairing a loose fence and bringing in extra firewood. Every now and then, he glanced at the cabin door, thinking about the young mother and her baby waiting inside. He didn't know why he felt the need to check, only that something inside him refused to let them out of his mind. When he returned to the cabin in the afternoon, he found Nayeli humming softly to her baby, rocking him gently near the fire. It was a simple sound, soft and peaceful, but it filled the cabin with a warmth Caleb had not felt in years. The place felt different, not just lived in, but alive. He sat by the table and began repairing a broken stirrup. Nayeli looked at him several times, wanting to speak, but unsure if she should. Finally, she gathered her courage again and came a little closer, still holding her baby. She thanked him. Not with a quick word, but with slow, sincere gratitude. She said she had expected to die on the road, not make it to safety. She said she had knocked on his door because she saw a light and had prayed someone would be kind enough to help her. She said she could not repay him, but she would never forget what he had done. Caleb stopped working and looked at her. He told her she did not owe him anything. He said any decent person would have helped. But deep inside, he knew that was not entirely true. Not everyone would open their door to a stranger in the night, especially one carrying trouble. But he had done it without thinking. Something in her exhausted eyes had made him step forward instead of stepping back. Later in the day, Nayeli gathered more strength and walked around the outside of the cabin. She saw the horses grazing quietly and the small fields stretching out toward the distant hills. She breathed slowly, taking in the peaceful sight. For the first time since she fled her camp, she felt a sense of calm. This place, even if temporary, felt like a safe world, far from the fear behind her. Caleb watched from the porch, ready to help if she stumbled. She didn't speak much, but he saw the way her shoulders finally relaxed. He realized she was beginning to trust him, not completely yet, but enough to breathe easier. As the sun began to set, the sky turned golden, casting warm light over the land. Caleb cooked again, a simple meal of beans and bread. Nayeli helped set the table, and they shared quiet moments where their eyes met but neither spoke. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was gentle, something new and fragile growing between them. When night came, Caleb made sure the doors were securely locked. He checked outside once more before returning to the cabin. Nayeli noticed his caution, and though he said nothing, she understood he was protecting them. She wrapped her baby well and sat on the bed, watching him quietly. Before Caleb rested in his chair, Nayeli whispered something. She said she would leave once she was strong enough. She did not want to bring danger into his life. She did not want him to face the men who chased her. Caleb shook his head softly. He told her she was not a burden. He said she didn't need to think about leaving right now. Rest was what she needed, and protection was something he could offer without regret. Nayeli lowered her eyes, touched by his words. She lay down, holding her baby close, and for the first time in many nights, she slept without fear. Caleb sat in his chair again, listening to the soft breathing of mother and child. He felt the weight of the day, but it was not a heavy weight. It was a good one that gave his quiet life new meaning. He looked around his cabin, once a silent place, now warmed by two new souls. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he would face it with them. He was no longer just a man, living alone, on a ranch. He was someone who had been trusted with a fragile life and a frightened mother. And as he closed his eyes for the night, he promised quietly to himself that he would do everything he could to keep them safe. The next few days brought a slow but steady change to Caleb's quiet ranch. The land was the same, the sky just as wide, and the chores just as endless. But something inside the cabin felt different. The stillness that once filled the place now carried soft sounds: Atsadi's gentle breathing, Nayeli's quiet footsteps, and the faint hum she used to calm her baby. Though she remained careful and alert, she was beginning to feel safe enough to let her guard down a little. Caleb noticed every detail, even when he pretended not to. Nayeli recovered slowly. The exhaustion that had weighed her down the first morning was fading. Her eyes, once full of fear, began to show small sparks of strength again. Every day she helped Caleb a little more, not because he asked, but because she wanted to give back in whatever small ways she could. She swept the floors, washed dishes, and even fed the chickens with careful hands while holding her baby close. Caleb worked outside as always, repairing the barn roof, tightening fence posts, and chopping wood. But now, every time he looked toward the cabin, he felt a pull inside him, a strange feeling he had not known in years. He found himself listening for the baby's soft cry or the sound of Nayeli's gentle voice. The ranch no longer felt lonely. One crisp morning, Caleb saddled his horse and invited Nayeli to step outside for fresh air. She wrapped her baby securely in a blanket and walked to the porch. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in soft colors that stretched across the land. She stared quietly at the open fields, the horses grazing, and the vast horizon. For days, she had stayed in the cabin, too afraid of being seen. Now, seeing the peaceful land in the daylight felt like breathing for the first time. A small smile touched her lips as she watched Caleb's mare nudge him playfully. Caleb glanced at her, noticing the change. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. Even if it was just a brief one, it warmed him more than the morning sun. As the day went on, a gentle routine formed. Caleb chopped wood while Nayeli washed clothes near the water barrel. Atsadi lay on a soft blanket in the shade, waving his tiny hands. Sometimes the baby laughed quietly when Caleb walked by, and Caleb would stop, leaning down to make a small sound or tilt his hat in a silly way. It was the first time in years he felt comfortable enough to act playful, and it surprised even him. But despite the growing comfort, there was still a shadow that followed them. Nayeli kept glancing at the distant hills. Every sound made her tense for a moment, before she relaxed. Caleb saw the worry she tried to hide, but he didn't push her to talk. Instead, he kept an eye on the land himself, checking for tracks, scanning for movement, and listening for anything unusual beyond the wind. One afternoon, Caleb found fresh horse tracks near the far edge of his land. They were not from his horses. He crouched, studying the prints carefully. Someone had ridden through recently, maybe within the past day. Their horse had moved slowly, as if searching or watching. Caleb felt a tightening in his chest. He knew enough about trouble to recognize when danger was getting close. He didn't mention it to Nayeli that evening, not wanting to frighten her. She was feeding Atsadi near the fire when he walked in. When she looked up, he forced a calm expression, masking the concern in his mind. He would protect them, but he needed time to think. 2 days later, the danger became clearer. It was late afternoon when Caleb was feeding the horses in the corral. The sun hung low, giving the land a warm, orange glow. Nayeli was inside, bathing the baby in warm water. Everything felt peaceful until Caleb heard voices in the distance. Not just one voice, but several. He froze, straining his ears. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Men were speaking to each other, their tone sharp and impatient. They were too close. Caleb quickly moved behind the corral fence and looked toward the ridge that overlooked his property. 3 riders appeared, their figures small against the rising dust. They rode slowly, scanning the land. Caleb's jaw tightened. He recognized their posture, the way they leaned forward as they searched. These were not travelers. They were looking for something or someone. He walked quietly to the house, not wanting to alarm Nayeli too quickly. When he stepped inside, she looked up and immediately noticed something was wrong. She stopped drying the baby and stared at Caleb, her eyes silently asking for answers. He spoke calmly, choosing his words carefully. He told her riders were approaching. She stiffened instantly, clutching her baby to her chest. Fear filled her eyes again. The same fear she had worked so hard to push away these past days. Caleb placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He told her to stay inside and keep the baby close. He would speak to the riders and send them away. His voice was steady, but deep inside he felt a familiar readiness, the kind of alertness that came before danger. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him as quietly as possible. The riders came down the hill, dust rising around their horses' feet. When they saw him, they pulled their reins and stopped several yards away. Their expressions were cold, calculating. The man in the center, clearly the leader, spoke first. He asked if Caleb had seen a woman traveling with a baby. He claimed she belonged to their camp and had left without permission. His voice was calm, but there was something dark behind it that Caleb did not trust. Caleb stood still, meeting the man's gaze. He did not lie, but he did not tell the truth. He asked why they were searching. The man avoided the question, insisting the woman needed to return. He spoke as if she were property, not a human being. Caleb's expression hardened. He felt anger rise inside him, but he kept his voice steady. He told the riders that his land was private and that no one matching their description had come his way. He suggested they look elsewhere. The men exchanged glances, not believing him completely. The leader leaned forward and warned Caleb that the woman had caused trouble, and that anyone helping her would face consequences. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, making his stance clear. He told them to leave his land. His tone remained calm, but there was strength behind it. Strength the riders recognized. The leader held his stare for a long moment before finally pulling back on his reins. With a final threat, the three men turned their horses and rode away slowly. Caleb watched them until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he exhale, letting the tension ease out of his shoulders. He went back inside. Nayeli stood in the middle of the room, holding Atsadi tightly. Her face showed both fear and guilt. She apologized again and again, telling Caleb she had brought danger to him. She said she would leave in the morning to keep him safe, but Caleb shook his head firmly. He told her it wasn't her fault. He told her she had a right to protect her child, and that no one deserved to be threatened the way she had been. He said they were safe with him, and he meant it. Nayeli's eyes softened, touched by his words, but he could still see fear within them. She sat down slowly, calming her baby with soft whispers. Caleb sat across from her, silent for a moment. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with warmth and light. Caleb thought about what had happened outside the riders, the threats, the danger creeping closer. But he did not regret helping her. In fact, his resolve grew stronger. He would not let anyone harm the young mother or her child. He was not a man who ran from responsibility. And now, two fragile lives were tied to his. Later that night, when Nayeli and Atsadi finally slept, Caleb remained awake again. He sat near the window, watching the land outside. He listened for hoofbeats, for voices, for anything unusual. The night stayed quiet. The sky was clear, and stars covered the dark sky like a blanket of silver light. Caleb thought about the bond that had formed so quickly between him and the two people resting in his cabin. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how far the riders were willing to go. But one thought was clear in his mind. He would stand between Nayeli and danger, no matter what it cost. As the night carried on, He felt something settle inside him, something strong, something steady. He was not just protecting strangers now. He was protecting something that felt like the beginning of a family. Caleb barely slept that night. The fire burned low in the corner of the cabin while he kept watch from his chair, eyes drifting from the door to the small window. The memory of the riders' cold eyes stayed fresh in his mind, and he knew they were not the kind of men who gave up easily. The land was quiet, but quiet did not mean safe. He listened closely to the wind, to the faint rustle of dry grass outside, to every shift of the wooden walls. Anything could be a sign of approaching trouble. Inside the cabin, Nayeli held her baby close, sleeping lightly as if part of her remained on guard even in rest. Atsadi breathed softly against her chest, tiny and unaware of the danger outside. Caleb looked at them often through the night. Something strong and protective rose within him each time he saw them together. They were depending on him, maybe not fully by choice, but by trust. He could not let them down. When dawn came, spreading pale light across the land, Caleb stood and stretched his tired limbs. He stepped outside quietly and scanned the ridge where the riders had appeared the day before. Nothing moved except a distant hawk gliding above the fields. His land looked calm, almost peaceful, but he knew better than to trust appearances. After a short while, Nayeli stepped outside too, cradling Atsadi in her arms. She looked tired but calmer than the previous night. She stood beside Caleb, watching the horizon with him. She hesitated before speaking, her voice soft and filled with worry. She said she did not want him to face danger because of her. She repeated her promise to leave once her strength returned. Caleb turned to her, shaking his head gently. He reminded her that running alone would not protect her. Those riders would chase her again, and she would have no shelter, no food, and no protection for her baby. He told her staying on the ranch was safer than wandering the land without help. He had already decided he would protect her as long as she needed it. His tone was firm, steady, and full of quiet commitment. Nayeli looked down at her baby. She had been strong for so long, carrying fear day and night. But now she felt something different, hope, however faint it was. She nodded slowly, accepting his words, even though guilt still lingered in her heart. As the morning passed, Caleb saddled his horse and prepared to ride to town. Nayeli watched anxiously, knowing he was leaving to speak to someone who could help. Caleb explained he would visit the lawman, a fair and honest man who handled disputes between ranchers, travelers, and nearby communities. If anyone could stop those riders from returning, it was him. Before leaving, Caleb asked Nayeli to stay inside the cabin, keep the baby close, and lock the door behind him. She agreed, though worry clouded her eyes. He told her he would return by midday. With one last reassuring look, he rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The ride to town was long but familiar. Caleb kept his horse steady and his thoughts sharp. The riders' threats echoed in his mind, and he replayed their expressions, their tone, their body language. He knew they weren't simply searching, they were hunting. He needed to act before they gained the courage to come back in greater numbers. When he reached town, people greeted him with nods. Caleb rarely spoke much, but everyone knew him as a dependable man. He went straight to the sheriff's small office near the edge of town. Sheriff Briggs, a sturdy man with gray in his beard and sharp, intelligent eyes, listened as Caleb explained everything: how a frightened Apache mother arrived at his door, how she spoke of threats, and how men had ridden onto his land demanding her return. Sheriff Briggs leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. He had heard rumors about certain troublemakers stirring up conflict in tribal areas, trying to gain power by using fear. He knew such men often took advantage of women and widows, believing no one would stand up for them. He also knew Caleb was not someone to exaggerate or stir trouble without reason. After hearing everything, Briggs stood up with a determined expression. He told Caleb He would take care of it. The riders had no right to take the baby, and they had no authority to force Nayeli back. The sheriff said he would ride out with a deputy, find those men, and make it clear they were violating both local law and tribal agreements. He would make sure they backed off permanently. Caleb felt relief wash through him. He thanked the sheriff and rode home immediately, wanting to return to Nayeli and Atsadi as quickly as possible. But even as he hurried back, he kept watch for riders. Each hill he crossed felt like a test, each stretch of land a reminder of the danger still near. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Nayeli sat by the window, holding her baby close and watching the road anxiously. Every sound made her pause and listen. She prayed Caleb would return safely. She did not know much about him, but she trusted him with more than her own life. She trusted him with her child's safety too. When Caleb finally appeared on the horizon, Nayeli exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She stepped outside before he even reached the porch, worry mixing with relief in her eyes. Caleb dismounted quickly, reassuring her that everything was settled. He explained what the sheriff had promised, and how those men would no longer have any right to come near her. Nayeli covered her mouth with her hand, tears gathering quietly in her eyes, not tears of fear this time, but tears of relief. She held her baby close, thanking Caleb with a trembling voice. She said she didn't understand why he was helping her so much when he barely knew her. Caleb replied that helping someone in need didn't require knowing their whole story. It only required having a heart. The rest of the day passed with a lighter feeling in the air. Nayeli seemed more at ease, her shoulders no longer as tense. Caleb worked in the yard, repairing the barn door. Occasionally, she stepped outside and watched him, noticing the quiet strength in the way he moved, the patience in his actions. She wondered how a man who lived so quietly could carry so much kindness inside him. That evening, Caleb cooked a warm meal of stew and cornbread. Nayeli helped set the table again, this time without the same sense of nervousness. They shared a meal, and though the conversation was simple, something warm grew between them: trust, comfort, maybe even the quiet beginning of friendship. After dinner, while Nayeli rocked Atsadi gently to sleep, Caleb watched them from across the room. The firelight reflected softly on their faces, and he felt something shift inside him. He had never expected his quiet life to change. He had never expected anyone to enter his world like this unexpectedly, desperately, and with such deep need. But now, he couldn't imagine the cabin without them. Once the baby slept, Nayeli approached Caleb slowly. She thanked him again, this time not just for the shelter or the protection, but for believing her when no one else had. She said he saved her life and her child's life, and she would never forget it. Caleb looked at her with gentle eyes and told her she was stronger than she realized. She had crossed dangerous land alone, carried her child through cold nights, and stood against men who threatened her. He said she was brave, and her child was lucky to have her. Nayeli lowered her eyes, touched by his words. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. That night, the cabin felt different, warmer, more alive, almost like a home. The fear that had once clung to the air was fading. There was peace now, and a sense of safety no longer built on hope alone, but on real protection and support. Caleb stayed awake a little longer, watching the fire fade. Nayeli slept peacefully, her baby curled against her. Outside, the wind was calm, and the land rested under a blanket of stars. As he closed his eyes at last, Caleb realized something he had not expected. He didn't just want to protect them for a few days. He wanted them to stay. He wanted them to be part of his life, not out of duty, but out of a feeling deeper than he had words for. A lonely cowboy's cabin had become a shelter, then a safe haven, and now the beginning of something much more, a new family formed not by blood, but by kindness in a moment of need. And as the sun rose the next morning, shining softly through the cabin window, Caleb knew that his life had changed forever the moment he opened his door that stormy night. and he was grateful for it.